Good evening. My name is Reihana Gallardo. I'm a senior from Mexico City studying art history and Latin American studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Davis Museum virtual presentation by artist Lisa Reihana, whose visually stunning and conceptually provocative digital panorama In Pursuit of Venus, Infected, is on view through December 18. Reihana is joined in conversation by Brook Andrew, artist and curator who was artistic director of the 22nd Biennale of Sydney in 2020. Please note that the Davis will close on December 19 for renovations and will reopen in February 2024 with the career survey of Wellesley alumni artist Lorraine O'Grady, class of 1955. Lorraine O'Grady's both and. I hope that you will visit this fall. We will begin with a native land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Davis Museum at Wellesley College is built on ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize that the United States removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of Indigenous lands and the attempted erasure of Indigenous cultures and languages. We further acknowledge the oppression, injustices, and discrimination that Indigenous people have endured, and that there is much work to be done on the important journey to reconciliation. We commit to strengthen our understanding of the history and contemporary lives of Indigenous people and to steward this land. We further recognize the many Indigenous people living here today, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Nipmuc nations, who have rich ancestral histories in Wellesley and its surrounding communities. Today, their descendants remind us that they are still here, where they maintain a vital, invisible presence. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these peoples and this land, as well as the strength of Indigenous culture and knowledge, the continuing existence of tribal sovereignty, and the principle of tribal self-determination. To participate in this program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We're using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions. Live captioning is provided through our Zoom webinar, and you can turn it on and off with the closed captions button at the features bar, which is at your bottom of your screen. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Lisa Fishman, Ruth Gordon Shapiro, class of 1937, director of the Davis Museum, who will introduce our guest speaker.
My thanks to Reihana Gallardo for so ably introducing our event this evening, and to media specialist at the Davis, Serena Conradi, for her work at the back end in organizing this webinar. Let me also reiterate a warm welcome and invitation to visit the Davis this fall. Māori artist Lisa Reihana's visually stunning and conceptually provocative digital panorama, In Pursuit of Venus, Infected, is based on a fashionable early 19th century French scenic wallpaper, Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, that capitalized on popular fascination with the voyages of Captain James Cook and other European explorers to the South Pacific. Reihana destabilizes the dominant historical narrative of encounter, centering Indigenous people as agents rather than subjects, privileging Native realities, experiences, and points of view. The critique embedded in the work is political, aesthetic, technological, and historical, rendered through a decolonial lens. The exhibition at the Davis and related programs, including this webinar, are generously supported by the Mildred Cooper Glimcher Class of 1961 Endowed Fund, the Davis World Cultures Fund, the Davis Museum Endowed Fund for International Cultural Programs, and Wellesley College Friends of Art. Now let me introduce our speakers. Lisa Reihana is a multidisciplinary artist whose practice spans film, sculpture, costume and body adornment, text, and photography. Since the 1990s, she has significantly influenced the development of contemporary art and contemporary Māori art in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She has earned an outstanding reputation as an artist, producer, and cultural interlocutor with her attention to the myriad complexities of contemporary photographic and cinema languages expressed in myriad ways. Her ability to harness and manipulate seductively high production values is often expressed through portraiture, where she explores how identity and history are represented and the intersection of these ideas with concepts of place and community. Reihana represented New Zealand at the Venice Biennale in 2017 with the video installation In Pursuit of Venus Infected. The work premiered originally at the Auckland Art Gallery in May of 2015 and has since become a seminal work in Aotearoa New Zealand's art history canon. In Pursuit of Venus Infected has been shown around the world and garnered widespread critical acclaim. Her work has been featured in many important solo and group exhibitions, including at museums and venues across New Zealand, in London, Jerusalem, Sydney, Amsterdam, Winnipeg, and New York, and of course, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Brook Andrew's interdisciplinary art practice is driven by the collisions of intertwined narratives, often emerging from the mess of the colonial wuba, or whole. His practice is grounded in his perspective as an Australian Widjarari and Celtic person. Brook's artworks, museums interventions, research, leadership roles, and curatorial projects challenge the limitations imposed by power structures, historical amnesia, and complicity to center and support Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Brook's work, including video and live performance, has been exhibited across Australia and internationally, most recently in Berlin, Paris, Kochi, Geneva, and Eindhoven. As a curator, Brook was the artistic director of the First Nations and artist-led Near-In, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney in 2020. He was also an international advisor for the Sami Pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennale in 2022, and a co-curator of Yoi, Care, Repair, Heal at the Gropiusbau in 2022. Brook is Enterprise Professor in Interdisciplinary Practice and Director of Reimagining Museums and Collections at the University of Melbourne. He holds a DPhil from the Ruskin School of Art, University of Oxford. My welcome to Lisa Reihana and Brook Andrew. It is an honor and a privilege to have you with us this evening.
Kia ora, Lisa, and kia ora, Brook. Yama to you. I'm just going to launch in, if I may, unless, Brook, you would like to look at, honestly, it's an honor and a privilege to be part of this talk and to have this opportunity to talk alongside Brook, because we've known each other for many, many years. And he's one of the busiest artists that I know, running around the world, making things happen.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you hold that that title very much alongside me. And if I'm looking a bit tired, everyone, it's just because I'm still a bit jet lagged from coming back from India and the UAE, working on a few projects there. But I'm so excited to be here today and to speak with you, Lisa, about your incredible and important and urgent work. And I just wanted to thank everybody here and of course at the museum for also inviting me. And thank you, Lisa, for inviting me as well. I'm really looking forward to us talking about some really important, and like I said, urgent art practice.
Cool. Well, look, I'm going to jump in and start with a keynote, and I've asked Brook to kind of respond as we're moving through this discussion, and also at the end of the presentation, there's time for a Q&A. So I hope that there's some interesting concepts and ideas and cultural histories and as Brook says, urgent questions that we can discuss in a safe space, even though we're in this kind of, we're in a worldwide space. And I think the acknowledgement of country really, it's very heartening for me to see that this is something that happens all the time. So I'm just going to jump in and share my screen, and let's just get this going. So I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of the country that I'm related to through my father.
Ngā mihi kia koutou to all the people who are gathered here today. This is a beautiful acknowledgement of the area that my dad comes from, but it actually starts with the house of Papatuanuku and Ranginui, who are part of every Māori person's creation story. And so Papatuanuku is the earth mother, and Ranginui is the sky father. And they are really important because the energy that is between these two spaces is the land of the living, those of us today. So from a Māori perspective, we always think that we are stars. We are lucky to be alive and to be born and to have this time on earth. And so it behoves us to think about the space that they create and the space that we live between. Puhanga Tohora is the mountain. Māori always talk about the mountains that is the closest to where they're brought up, the sea, and the houses in between. So to call yourself part of the Ngāpuhi tribe or the iwi that I am connected to, you must be born between the several mountains, which is Puhanga, Tohora, Te Ramaroa, Rahiri, Pangaru, Papata, Maunga Taniwha, Tukarau, Rākau Mangamanga, Manaia, Tūtā Moi, and Maunganu. So those are the several mountains that if you're born between them, then you can rightfully claim your lineage to the Ngāpuhi iwi. It's very proud for me to be part of Ngāpuhi, and it's also really interesting because I've never lived there. This is a lineage that comes through my father's bloodline. He left his tribal homelands to move to Auckland, which is the biggest city in New Zealand, back in the 1940s and 1950s. The economy meant that there was very poor areas. These Māori tribal areas were quite poor, and he came to the city to make money to send home for his brothers and sisters. And that's why I'm sort of a first generation urban Māori artist. And it's something that's really framed and changed the type of art practice that I make. So I just wanted to set the tone of country and what that means for me, but also to acknowledge my mother, who is of Welsh and English descent. So it's a real, like for many in Australia, we have these very strange relationships back to England, the so-called homeland, because there's many people of mixed heritage, mixed bloodlines. And of course, there's the political relationships to that, but also, you know, our parents can be of many different relationships. So I remember the first time when I went to England, I carried this great anger, a great big chip on my shoulder, but I was walking down the streets of London and feeling nobody there really knew the reality that I had come from. So, you know, there's this kind of ideas of where you come from and then the reality, which are the people that you know and love. Brook, just at this point, do you want to talk about your history and your kind of background? It kind of seems like a nice time to do it.
Yeah,
no,
absolutely. No. I was like saying, yeah, anyway, yes, absolutely. And Ngajingang and Daraga, it's ICU, and I don't really see everyone out there. You can see us, but it's an acknowledgement in Wiradjuri, which is my mother's family, and of Western New South Wales. There's about 300 different Aboriginal nations in Australia with, you know, different languages. It's very complex. Diversity here as it is in other Indigenous spaces around the world, as I know also in the Americas. But thank you so much. And it was so lovely to hear about, the kind of placement of land and the relationship to sky and earth. And so Wiradjuri is known as the land of the Kalamide, which is the three rivers which really bind and hold Wiradjuri country together. But I'm calling in from Gadigal lands that Lisa knows very well in Sydney. And I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all the elders here. And I was born on Gadigal land, and my grandmother grew up in an Aboriginal mission, very similar to these kind of reserves and missions where the British and other colonizers went, and under certain policies of segregation, which is really the apartheid system that happened, and lots of people don't think that. And I think that, Lisa, I share your sentiment, like many Indigenous people from the Pacific, when we do go back to the UK or somewhere else, people really don't understand the kind of duress and but also active warfare there was between our peoples and other peoples. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that we have fought for our land, and we still do. And even if it is through acts of creativity, like our practices do. But yes, it's good to see you. And yeah, let's continue.
Hilda, thank you. Cool. Well, look, it's really nice to have Brook as part of this conversation, and we share some really similar activities in our art practice, and that I really early on had an opportunity. I was invited to work with Te Papa, which is the National Museum based in Wellington, and so that was my first opportunity to kind of work with their collections, and so it was quite different than working with galleries. Galleries are often, they're called the white wall space, whereas museums are very interesting places to research with, and you have a very different kind of relationship to what you're putting on the walls. The exhibitions or the presentations of material that are on show really change the way that you sort of, well, for me, that I think about the context of the projects that you're taking in there. So this is just some images that I wanted to talk about. I made this work called Native Portraits, end up 19897. That last series of numbers was really talking about the notion of accessioning, or the work that was commissioned going into that collection, and me sort of coming to understand the kind of the practices, the acquisitive practices that museums partake in. I think working with a national museum, sometimes museums around the world, they end up having booty. They have this incredible collection of stolen, traded, and bought materials, sometimes gifted. And that's something that I started to learn about through the making of native portraits. But one of the things I was really thinking about was the notion of community, populist material, the sorts of images that happen to be in the museum. So I really started at this time to form a philosophy and a way of working, which was of image making as opposed to taking. And that was, working in a studio with communities of people, of friends and friends of friends and family, to look at the kind of imagery that had really set the tone of the way that Māori understood themselves, very much driven by early 19th century photographic practices. The image on the left-hand side was my way of creating what is a Māori gateway, which we always walk through to go into a marae, which is where we gather. where Māori have lived traditionally, and those would normally be used wooden carving and would depict ancestral figures. What I was doing was kind of filming people as these kind of video portraits, because I was really interested in this idea of the living, breathing face. And also creating a community for an art gallery, because normally it would be related to a tribal area, whereas creating an artwork that could travel from one place to another was really kind of breaking or developing traditions. Also learning at that time, and it's quite a provocative idea, is generally carvings of ancestors are of people who have passed. You're not usually memorialized until you've passed away, and that was because it kind of predates photography in a sense. So they become the document, the artifact, the image of some person who had lived previously, and it was the memorial to that person. So you're not generally creating images until someone's passed. So this is quite a provocative thing to do at the time. The image in the middle, I love that because it's me and my dad. That's my dad, Huri Waka, and I was looking at Fontana knitting patterns, these kind of cute Māori knitwear. We're both wearing cans of beer on our head that have been turned into hats. I love this idea of recycling and how women have over the years taken things and created other expressions with them. But also it's just it's kind of almost like a no-no to put something to do with food or something that you eat to feed your body and put it on your head. Your head is considered quite a sacred part of the body. But my dad always loved a good beer, and he tried brewing beer for a while. So I really enjoy this kind of very early photograph of the two of us. And I think making art is not just, there's so many reasons to do it. For me, I sort of think about the work that you end up with is like an artifact, and it's kind of ends up being the result of time, energy, conversations, people that you work with, a deadline. Sometimes you might want to take an idea further, but you can only get so far. And so these are the sorts of images that are left to share with an audience. And then that's a point where conversations start to happen as well. The image on the right-hand side is a dear friend, Melissa Weekairi, and she's since passed too, and so it's lovely to see that image of her. But working with Motat, which is a museum in Auckland, and she's wearing a nurse's uniform from the Second World War. So, just starting to learn that you can actually work with museums, start to look at these histories and places where women, had a great effect in the world. So that's Native Portraits. It was a massive project. I think I was in my 20s, and it was a 17-channel video work. I've always been quite interested in complex storytelling. I made 6 short videos that were centered around minutes before an image was taken in a studio. I worked with a scriptwriter, and we looked at some images that were in the Te Papa collection and kind of write stories around them that started to talk about the histories and to think about, sometimes images were taken and used for very much a populist carte de visite of the time. Other images ended up in these archives because they were commissioned by Māori for Māori. So really starting to examine different reasons why imagery ended up in the world. And then around this wakaroa, or this gateway form, which is on the left-hand side, I made a 17-minute soundtrack and invited lots of different people to come in and read stories or the conversations the communications that were back on postcards. So I've got a great big postcard collection dating back to the 1900s and all the way through populist times, and to sort of look at how the circulation of this imagery and how it kind of set the way that we look. A few years ago, gosh, I think it was 1996, I worked with Cambridge Museum, which I know Brook has also worked with. And I worked with this is the one carving. So this is more traditional carving practice and what it looks like. When I was invited to create a work for this exhibition, I asked to work with a carving piece. And this is called He Tautoko, which means to stand this work up. But also when you support somebody, it might be with a song. I wanted to also bring focus to this carved piece. It had ended up in the Cambridge Museum. It didn't have a name. We don't know the ancestor's name. So what I did is, you can see on the left-hand side, I worked with a vitrine, beautiful old-fashioned vitrine, which is part of the original building of the museum. But I recorded a whole lot of other material. I recorded things in Aotearoa in New Zealand at home, but also other items from their collection, and put them behind this ancestor. And then on the front, you can see there's 3 handsets. I recorded songs, so the people who, the visitors to the museum, could pick them up. You could almost create your own soundtrack. There were music, song, again, the descriptions of what this piece, how he'd been considered through time. There was about 6 different descriptions. And it was really nice. So when people lifted the headsets to listen to these recordings, and because he's wearing these 1970s headphones, it was almost like you're in conversation with this ancestor. So what I wanted to do was use this as an opportunity for people to really consider this work quite deeply in a way he may not have been thought about when presented with a whole lot of other carving pieces. And this is a work that I made for Venice Biennale. Again, this was kind of expanding my practice. I think over the years, I've started, particularly in the first instance, with a reckoning of my own cultural material, as I said before, being having an urban backdrop, upbringing, and then trying to learn about my own knowledge from home, but then broadening that out to a sort of general understanding of how Māori are, why we are where we are today, and then starting to make some bigger, more sweeping statements, having travelled around the world, meeting other Indigenous people, sort of understanding the similarities and the differences of these kind of practices and where we are. This is a beautiful piece that is in the Cambridge Museum. I met him. I do love the material culture that's from the Nooka area. So I call him Nooka Ancestor. He's collected into the Cambridge Museum. He stands probably about 14 inches tall. He's got this incredible, very powerful human hair, and this beautiful carved face, which also to me sort of talks to that kind of seals, that kind of design of seals, and then this beautiful piece. So I was thinking about, when you work with museums, it's really tricky for them when they've got a whole of material from all around the world, many different tribal places. Sometimes they don't know what these pieces are, where they come from. So when they photograph them, they're always on a neutral background. I wanted to do something different, which is to have an image from Nooka Sound, from that area, and sort of place this ancestor back into that kind of a space. So I created this image as a way of almost taking them home. So again, kind of these strategies that have been employed for he tautoko, and then thinking about this lovely ancestral figure and trying to give him a sense of home and what that might look like. So those are just a few works. I've done many works, but I just wanted to share those as this idea of mining the archive. Brooke, I wondered if there's anything that you would like to comment on at this point.
No, absolutely, Lisa, and thank you so much for sharing these especially these three really important moments, really, because there have been many moments, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the 90s, I mean, like as you say, as an urban-based kind of artist, or artists that are living within cities, and we're traveling a lot more, these collections have really laid quite silent, from our ancestors for many generations. And to be able to get into museums, and actually for the museums to open up to us as well, and for us to be kind of like really on the on kind of really knocking on the door, and the first work about the Maorian entering into that space and kind of being influenced by the colonial and ethnographic photographs for you to create and insert your own family into those spaces has been very challenging for a lot of museums today, and even like historically. And I think that the kind of younger generation of students that might be watching this webinar maybe don't have an idea of really how experimental and inspirational that is, but also how incredibly difficult it is, both culturally, but also ethically, but also what it is. How do we own our culture again? How is it that we reposition the culture? And I think that the three examples you've given, especially working with the ethnographic museums and the archaeology and anthropology museum in Cambridge with Nicholas Thomas, that we both know, who has also been, very helpful in helping us and collaborating with us. And I just wanted to ask if you could share a little bit more about what's it like to be in that space, if you can think back to the 90s and you think, wow, the wealth of all of this information and these collections that are not in our communities or in our families. And so then what's it feel like to actually go into those spaces, not only in Aotearoa, but then travel overseas? And you gave us a little bit about what's it like when you went over there and you were feeling really angry about it. But then, 20, 30, so many years later, do you know what I mean? Which I know you're going to launch into a bit later in the talk. But I just really think there's a capturing of that moment, early on.
Well, I think it's what's really interesting is the types of people who are brave enough to open up those doors. I worked initially, the Native Portraits project came out of an invitation from Ian Weddy, who was a really interesting curator working at the National Museum at that time. And he trained Megan Tamati Quinnell. I mean, that's how we started to work together at that time. So he was quite visionary and smart in that he could see that if museums didn't start to actually really question themselves and their own practices, that in some ways they're going to get left behind. So he was like Nicholas Thomas, was somebody who was trying to reinvigorate and bring these stories up to date, and to start thinking about what are we actually doing with these collections, and what does it mean. I think for me it was really interesting to start playing with these collections, because most people want to go in with really big bags and steal some of that stuff and take it home, right? I mean, that's a really interesting thing. I remember being at the launch of Quai Branly in Paris, and there was some Ralph Regevenel who was working in museums at that point in time. He was talking about strategies of, okay, what could museums do? They have access to incredible resources. He pitched a really interesting idea at that time, in that he wanted to bring some of the materials home from Paris and share them back into the community. So, okay, well, why don't we'll lend you You know, we'll lend you some more recent material culture, and we can bring stories with them. And let's bring some of those older pieces home so that we don't lose the stories. Let's let them circulate, and we can share those stories back to you, because then there's a conversation that starts to happen, and you've got the resources that we don't have. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And there was a delegation from Africa who were asking for some of the heads back, and they were very much there to get that material home. And of course, museums and indeed governments have quite strict, big restrictions about letting these things leave the shores. We don't want to trade items that are like under pressure. So I think suddenly understanding some of these complex political and cultural issues are really interesting. I mean, I'll just share a story. Te Papa, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, have made a long-term loan of an incredible Hawaiian cloak. It's absolutely beautiful, a red feather cloak. And it's on long-term loan, and that means it's actually been gifted back to Hawaii, but it was a way that they could get around not having to officially, I don't know, there's something with the laws, and that was a way that they could return this cloak, which I think had its relationships with King Kamehameha. So they showed it for the last time in Wellington. I was lucky enough to be in the city at that time, so I went to visit him, and then I was in Hawaii for the Hawaiian Biennale, and then saw it installed at the Bishop Museum, which was really wonderful to see it had been returned home. So this idea of a long-term loan was one way that they could get around a whole lot of technical stuff that museums are making. So I think there's some good news stories, but certainly when you look at, you know, as a student, anyone who's out there, it's really amazing if you get to have a fiddle in the back rooms, because, you know, there's all this incredible material there. Lots of it's not on show for various reasons, but, you know, there's probably about 90% of the material is not on show. So it gives you a sense of some of the material that's just sitting there wasted. I mean, even in Cambridge Museum, a lot of material came back from Aotearoa, from Australia, from all around the world, and they haven't even been, you know, boxes still haven't even been opened. So it kind of makes you feel a bit angry if you could have those things circulating back at home. Right, I feel like we should just jump ahead. Tradition and change. I wanted to show some of this portraiture material which kind of generated out of those ideas. These are a couple of my nieces, and on the left is Ruby, she's East Wind, and on the right is Ariane, and I see her as the West Wind. It was a nice project to sort of instead, after making native portraits, where a lot of the portraits are quite dark and spooky, I really wanted to think, how can I create imagery for the future that would sort of draw in, you know, younger people. And so I've got this, I collect glass. I love beautiful art glass. So I wanted to photograph my nieces against these kind of backdrops that had this sort of, I don't know, this glacial feeling to them, but this kind of light and this idea of, you know, through the looking glass, there's something quite sparkly and beautiful about them. And this was a wonderful opportunity to work with women weavers. I really love the weaving practices from home, and it was a nice opportunity to then sort of start looking at permission. And I went and met the various women. These cloaks, the clothing, the kakahu that my nieces are wearing are made by contemporary weavers. So it was really nice to go and meet the weavers and talk to them about making this kind of imagery and creating these kind of bright, sparkly images that are quite different to the way that women are often depicted. So they're quite youthful looking. These were made maybe 10 or so years ago. And this is a couple of images, again, looking at that idea of Papa Tuanuku, who's the Earth Mother. I made these series. This is a couple of stills taken from a video work called Ihi. So this is Tane and Nancy, a couple of friends that I've known for a long time. And of course, I wanted to play with this idea. This is the Earth Mother and her son, Tane. So Tane is the god that kind of pushed the parents apart and created the space of the world that we live in. And so it was really nice to, again, start to look at these old creation stories, but really present them in quite contemporary ways. If you look at their costume, I'm really into costuming. My English grandmother was a costume designer, and I love the way that you can bring power to talent, make them move in a different way. So these the outfits that they're wearing are made of kind of plastics and other materials that work well in a green screen situation. My little jokers, these are both takatapui from the LGBTQI plus community. I say takatapui because it's a more cultural term, and it speaks to other aspects a bit different to the LGBTQI community. And for me, it was my sort of like slightly tongue-in-cheek joke that we have members of this community who are talking about our creation stories. But these two have known each other for a very long time, and they hadn't seen each other for a long time. So it was lovely to bring them together and talk about that sort of love and care that comes from mother to son. So I wanted to, show our creation stories in a different way, not just the Earth Mother and Sky Father, but this intergenerational thing that passes down through the ages. It's a really beautiful video. I wish I had time to show you that. And then earlier this year, I did a project for the Wellington Arts Festival. I threw this one in here. Te Whiki o Muturangi, who was the octopus. She travelled right across from Tahiti to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and she was chased by Kupe. And he is the ancestor who discovered Aotearoa. He discovered New Zealand, lived here for a year, needed to be here for a year to wait for the trade winds that could bring him back up to Tahiti. And so his nephew Nuku Tawhiti is the ancestor who brought everybody down to the area where I came from. So that very first chant that I showed, talking about where the Ngāpuhi people come from, they followed this octopus across the ocean and discovered New Zealand. I think I wanted to put her in because it just shows I do also have a sculptural practice as well, and I wanted to put this in here because I know that Brook's done some inflatables, and it's really cool to kind of make these big incredible objects. And she sat in the harbour down in Wellington, had these kind of patterns that I have. I know Brook's quite similar actually, Brook, to your work, but I wanted to put her in here too because some of these ancestral stories, there's always these histories of men chasing women. It's like they kind of drive them wild, and kind of they become these aspects of these stories that they travel across the ocean, and they're sort of in between two worlds, the human world and the other world. There's other energies, there's other presences that create these contexts that lead to really big events happening. So I just wanted to throw those down and to see if there's anything that you would like to comment on based on those stories, Brooke.
Absolutely, I'm loving this this dialogue and you sharing. I mean, the most important thing about especially these kind of three sets of works you've just now shared as part of this next reflection on your practice is really around creation stories, very obviously. And I think that it's very powerful for I think non-Indigenous people, other Indigenous people from around the world, to understand the kind of solidarity in regard to the way in which that we see our worldview, and that it does predate any Western colonial invasion or documentation or discovery. And I love the way you just use the word discovery in the context of your creation figure here, and the way in which, you know, it came down and discovered Aotearoa. And I think it's really important to push the historical boundary of time and dates, because they are not based around the very dominant narratives of often, you know, colonial men from Europe going out and creating spaces, etc. These are time beyond even timelines, like historical kind of Western timelines. And I remember many years ago, I think it was in 2000, Lisa, we were in New Caledonia, and with the Kanak, and it was like the big Indigenous Pacific conference, and many people were talking about how all of our connections to each other as Indigenous peoples across the planet, like we all have different timelines, but they were not based on kind of Western timelines. And these kind of intimate kind of narratives and stories that weave, especially for you mob, you know, how you kind of, like you mentioned Vanuatu and Hawaii, and how you're related. And so there's really complex genealogies as well. And I was just wondering, I mean, I don't know how much time we've got, but I mean, I would love to, you know, for you to share a little bit more about the kind of complex creation stories, but also genealogies, because that's how you map your ancestors as well, and who you are as people.
Sure, and it's nice to just hear it when you were talking. I forgot. I mean, there's so many different things that I think about when I'm making work. Ngā Haue Whā, the four winds, I wanted to work with that as a concept, because Ngā Haue Whā, we always, when we do when people gather, we were talking about how the four winds blow people together. And, you know, there's always often the male deities or male ancestors are privileged, and so my job, I come from a family of four girls, to photograph my four nieces is almost, in a way, it's a stand-in for a portrait of us via them. But also, when I heard about Tāwhare Mātia, he's the god of winds, I heard the story about how he had a cloak, and depending on which direction he's blowing, the cloak would be, of the four corners are almost like compass points, and they're female deities. And that's how I sort of thought about my nieces. And when I think about them and their personalities, they very much embody. I've only shown two here because time was limited, but you know, it's a way of mapping our whakapapa, which is our genealogy, but also connecting us to those other creation stories, which Māori always do through their, when we do our karakia and our chanting and our talking, we're making our connections with each other. So I sort of feel like we're probably running out a bit of time because I'm talking a lot. So I'm going to jump forward to collaboration. During Wellington, when I made this Te Whiki o Muturangi, this is a statue that lives in Wellington. It was made in the 1940s. It's quite beautiful. It's made by a Western man, William Trithui. So there's Kupe Raiatia, his wife, Hine Te Aparangi, and the tohunga, Hine Te Aparangi. Sorry, I've forgotten their names, and I don't want to mangle them, so I shall just keep moving ahead. But this work gave me an opportunity to work with another artist. She made a song called Aotearoa, which I worked with her and asked her to play it next to the sculpture. And what I liked about that song is it talks about the wives of Kupe. She's known by many different names according to which tribe you come from, but she was also a navigator in her own right. So this is Kupe here. So I wanted to bring focus to things that were already around, you know, sites that already existed in Wellington, and make local people see them with renewed eyes. And one of the things I loved when I went to Hawaii is the way that they will use lei and dress the sculptures again. So this sculpture normally wouldn't have these beautiful adornments, and it was a way to bring in work with the Pacific community and ask them to make these adornments that we put onto this statue just for the duration of the festival. So on the right hand side, this was the opening event for the arts festival. We had these beautiful floral headdresses, and we were just putting them at the feet of the sculpture. So that was a really lovely way of opening up that space and bringing in communities. I recently did a collaboration with Christian Louboutin. I'm just going to play you a little bit of this, just so you can see.
Without words too, so it was very immediate.
So I wanted to show you this piece because Christian asked me to do a biography for him, and I thought that was kind of crazy because we didn't even know each other. So we decided that we needed to get to know each other first. So I did this was kind of looking at the things that influence his work. Certainly the red sole shoes was really important, but I chose this little section because I was riffing off of In Pursuit of Venus, this kind of traveling through someone's lifetime. On the left-hand side of the screen is a pohutakawa, and that's a New Zealand native tree. And when I went to his house in Portugal, it was flowering, and I couldn't believe that he had a native, a New Zealand native tree in there. This dancing legs are in a museum which he used to go to as a child. There were all these kind of ugly doors in there, but underneath was an aquarium. So I filmed the aquarium and filled the doors with these incredible fishes because he's made shoes and inspired by all sorts of things, including animals and what have you. But also to learn about him and his Egyptian heritage and I loved the image that he's drawing. I got him to he needed to make a drawing for the catalogue, and it was based on the shoe that he designed for Tina Turner. So he had fabulous stories, and it was a great opportunity that we came to know each other through this process of making this video. So it was interesting to be commissioned by somebody who's not not in the art world per se. It was for an exhibition that he showed in this museum, and then it was just in Monaco earlier this year. We travelled there to see another iteration of this of his exhibition. But really wonderful to work with somebody who loves art so much and is very interested in cultural material. So I just wanted to share that one. And then also a bit of AR project that I did. This is the inflatable Feki. I also kind of did this AR project. So it's almost like there was her body, but this is like her soul. I worked with a Fijian spoken word artist called Jara Wasasala, and her and I kind of collaborated. She started writing some words and I kind of edited them a little bit, and then we created this little video.
A name like that knows what is needed to build a pantheon's body. A name like that knows what it is like to crawl backwards into the sea.
So, Brooke, I'm thinking I might just jump into the next part because I think we've been talking quite a while. Is that okay with you? Unless there's anything you would like to say at this point?
No, I was thinking we should, definitely get on with it, because I think there's only half an hour
Get on with
left.
it. Hurry up.
No,
Okay.
you know what I mean. There's so much, I mean, when you're an artist, been making things for a long time, I think that it leads to really big projects like what you're about to talk about in pursuit of,
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to jump in now, but I did want to show some other projects that have come out. I feel it's so great to be an artist. You learn so much along the way, that I've been able to apply some of the learnings and thinkings to these various different artworks. But yeah, In Pursuit of Venus started, it's almost 12 years ago that I started thinking about it. But I love starting with this image here because I first saw it at the Australian National Gallery, which is in Canberra. They have a complete set of the Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacific wallpaper, which James spotted at first. Before I started doing the very first shoot, I got permission to go back to the museum, and we went into their collection holdings, and I photographed it. I just wanted to see it again for myself, and I love this really old little iPhone 6, I think it was, because now it's much bigger and whole different time. But to me, I love that sort of the sense of technology and time, because the wallpaper itself was such a technical feat. I think I'll put a little bit of that. So I just always like to start with that. It's welcoming the new day. It was a real privilege to present in Pursuit of Venus, or get the gig to go to the Venice Biennale, because it did open up some doors for me. I originally made this work and I showed it at the Auckland Art Gallery, which is here in New Zealand. And for me, the work would never have been finished without having some Aboriginal content in it. And by getting the Venice Biennale, it opened up a number of doors, one of which was to work with Campbelltown Arts Centre, who helped me just do some recording with some local people, and just also to work with some elders to get some advice and to be able to make some more material before it went on show there. And then once it had those additional scenes in there, I felt like the work was much more polished and much more finished. Because for me, when I saw the original wallpaper, there was a real hierarchy of how Western people had sort of set, Māori and Tongan, which were called the Friendly Islands, and all these different things. And it's just like such an incredible and huge project to delve into. But for me, it was always, the wallpaper became a structure by which I could record people from different places and give them all a platform to speak to give them voice. So this is just an image from that early presentation of the work. But I just sort of I'll whip through some images just to give you a sense of the production of it. I was lucky enough to have a residency. It was in America at the time, which kind of put me closer, thinking about the First Nations people from that part of the world, particularly Canada, who Captain Cook travelled up through there, up into the Nootka Sound, and just have a studio where I just had really lots of photocopies and just put them up on the wall, and just spent time thinking about the various characters that the artist had met along the way, the European characters, and then also starting to make costumes. So at that time I was making the chief mourner costume from Tahiti. You can see on the table I was finding materials to be able to kind of recreate this costume so that I could record some scenes. I was really interested in that costume because of colonization, it was a practice that fell out of favor with the new European religions that came into practice. It was also very much overlooked by the European travelers at that time, but became very important later. But also I found it really fascinating because Joseph Banks went on what was called like a killing spree. Once a chief had died, the chief mourner costume would be invoked, and kind of pandemonium would break out around the village until a new chief was installed. And so I found this, it was almost like Joseph Banks went into a blacking up kind of, he had to black his face, and it's like this early kind of minstrel thing that I found really fascinating, this sort of going native, and how easy it was for him to sort of go native and then step out of that process as well. So this was really because it's such a complex wallpaper that has been driven from a very much a production perspective. The entrepreneur Joseph Dufour looked at these circulating illustrations that these white European artists were using of different characters and different times. So there was a lot for me to kind of look at, and there's so many more things that I could have done, but it was really great to have time to sort of think about those. This is a really important illustration because it was made by Tupaia, who was the Tahitian that became almost like Joseph Banks' pet. He made these images, and it's a really, for me, very interesting. I made a scene because one, what's her name, Dame Anne Salmond, she posited this idea that perhaps Tupaya might have been sitting with women who were making textiles at the time, because when you look at the inks and the drawings, the materials that were used, he could have been sitting with these women and retelling stories of things that he'd seen. And these two images on each side were done at different times. But for me, they're really interesting too, because Tupaya was using, you know, a Western illustration form, but translating that through his own eyes and his own imagery. He was the first person to make this drawing. So it was, you know, from his perspective, this was really an interesting thing for him to see. While I was making the work, a girlfriend was working on a book, and she unearthed this little illustration on the left-hand side, the Bride of Mangaia. And so I wanted to, you know, it was something that was coming to the forefront, something that was being really important for Cook Island person. So I wanted to take that and remake this kind of imagery as well. This idea of walking across the backs of other people, transporting somebody. You're so sacred at this time of marriage that you can't touch the ground. I really likened that to, from a Māori perspective, when you launch a canoe, a waka, it can't touch the ground. In the old days, it would have been, they would use bodies as skids, breaking their backs as it launched into the water. So there was this very amazing cultural stories, these specific ways that we see a vessel and how it's launched into the world. To some of the people that I work with, it was a really big thing for me, like just casting, working with lots of actors, and bringing all these people together. And again, this idea of making, not taking, and inviting people to be a part of this process, and having them, you know, really take on these kind of stories that I was thinking about, and them being the living, breathing face of the ancestors, the people that allowed them to be there in this project in the first place. You know, it was really important working with Hawaiian people, because of course that's where Captain Cook was murdered, or came to his demise or his death. So I timed some of the recordings. You know, it was made maybe I did 4 very, very short video recordings, you know, over a number of years. I'd make things, save up the money, you know, do other projects, save up the money, and then I could do some more, so I could keep adding to the project. So this was very much a project that took a long, long time to come to fruition. But what was wonderful in that time frame, I was meeting lots of other Pacific and Māori people who were telling me stories and things that they'd been passed down to them, so that they could almost be incorporated into the project at the end. Working with Ali, it took all day to draw his body up with this tattoo reference. So, you know, just spending time with all these different people so that we could create this project. It's all done as a green screen shoot. This is me a few years later when I did the last big shoot. And then, of course, the last bit was before I went to Venice, and having this opportunity to work in Australia and incorporate, you know, this possum skin making. You know, it was really, I'm really super proud of this little scene. It's really quiet in the work, and you and Davis will be able to see that there, because the women were so shy, and I spent some time with them. They would have these weaving circles, and I said, look, I really want you to be in it, because if you're not in it, then you're absent from the story, and it's really important that you become there. You just do what you need to do. I don't work with a lot of actors. I work with friends and acquaintances, people who, to me, sort of exemplify this idea of, you know, whatever that character is, and just working and talking with them. So it was really amazing working with the women in this process. And, you know, young up-and-coming artists, getting them to do some of the 3D vessels that you see in the background of the work. And the vessels are really important, because that's the superhighway. That's the way that we have come to know each other and learn from each other. So there's a whole lot of different aspects in there. This is an image of Professor Nick Thomas, who's with Cambridge Museum. He and I are looking at the chief mourner mask that they have in the Cambridge collection. So this project has opened up lots of doors to learn about all sorts of different aspects, because a lot of material culture has ended up in Russia and Europe, a lot of the European museums, and of course also in England. This is at the Royal Society. This is Captain Cook's, what do you call it, that he viewed the transit of Venus in. But really we went and recorded the clock, because this is the clock that sort of set Greenwich Mean Time, and they wind it up once a week. It still goes, and I was lucky enough to wind it up, and my partner James recorded that. So the moment before Captain Cook dies, you'll hear this winding sound, and that is this clock. And I found this clock really interesting. It's like a cyclops. It's not like a normal clock. And it was bolted into the boat. It went on lots of journeys all around the Pacific. But you'll also see that we photographed it and put it into the work. So there was a lot of learning from my perspective, and just working with these various different organisations. This is just a couple of images from the opening when In Pursuit of Venus went to Hawaii, and I was really proud. I mean, the artwork becomes one thing, but we used this as an opportunity to do a really beautiful porphyry, a kind of trans-cultural porphyry where people from many different island nations, we had this gathering, and we did a traditional ceremonies. There was lovely Hawaiian chanting, but it was the first time that it had ever happened in the Honolulu Art Museum. So the opportunities of different ways of using the artwork to then really start talking back to the communities who are looking after these the objects in the museums, but also the communities who live there or nearby are really important. And I knew this is a very earlier version of In Pursuit of Venus, shown at the Museum Van Loon, which is really interesting. Van Loon was the underwriter of the Dutch East India Company. So he was the insurance man. And this is shown in the Drakenstein room, where there is another wallpaper. But what I knew is there's a waka, which is a canoe, and this is based on the one that comes from my father's tribal homelands up north. So there was this really interesting thing where the Dutch students from the local university taught me to row my copy of it's not a copy, it's a new waka, and it's looked after in Holland, and so it's like a living document. So students come down from there every year, and they come to New Zealand and they learn about Māori culture up at Waitangi. So these were the students at that time, and they taught me to row the waka, and we used it as a kind of performance to open up that exhibition. So In Pursuit of Venus becomes a touchstone for other opportunities. And yeah, here's and while I was working on it, some of the characters that I worked with, I made some portraits so that then I could sell them through dealers, and then through that process I could raise money to keep working on the project, which took about 10 years in total to complete and finish. So as by and large was generated by myself, but I did get some funding from Creative New Zealand to just kind of initiate the project in the first instance. So yeah, I think I'm just going to stop there for a minute and see if there's some thoughts from Brook.
Wow, what a big breath. I remember we were talking before this webinar, and we were reflecting on when I came to visit you and James over there. And when you first really started this project, and I remember the technology that you're using and how the technology of capturing and making this work has changed, and you kind of like hinted at that when you were talking about the first iPhone you were using. But I also just wanted to check in, because we have about, what, 15 minutes left, is that right?
Yep, about 15.
About 15 minutes. Yeah, cool. Because it'd be great to know. I mean, I'm definitely going to, dive in a little bit here, but it'd be great to, see if there are some students or other questions, because I think that this is quite a rare opportunity to get hold of you, Lisa, in regards to, your work and your practice. But, I just think that there is something really quite extraordinary about trying to remap something like this, important, wallpaper, really. This kind of like, this vision of the other, this kind of romantic vision of the other world, and the way in which that really, as Indigenous people, were often captured within landscape, historical documentation to keep us kind of frozen into a very particular kind of way of being, and therefore challenging our own authenticity, as contemporary people. And we have always been contemporary people within the space that we hold, regardless if that was 400 years ago, 100 years ago, or now. And I remember being at Venice and seeing this incredibly vast kind of like wall, and it just kind of, apart from the technological feat, which we all can just only imagine, but it is really, again, kind of remapping through that genealogy, and something which really is so powerful in your practice about, okay, this is what the original kind of representation is, and you're going to get in there and you're going to change it. And I'd really love to hear what your responses from community and other Indigenous peoples, or even kind of taking it to Venice. You would have spoken to so many different people, but this kind of, again, remapping and representing kind of these visions. How was that in regard to the way in which people responded? Like, was there elation? Was there also maybe people thinking, how is it that you actually go and do a task like this as well?
Sure, yeah. Well, mostly people really love the work. I think I always love it. Hey, look, I'm putting words in people's mouth. No, people are kind of fascinated by it because it's so fast. When I came up with the idea, it's the only time I've really had a eureka moment. And the reason it's a eureka moment for me is I realized that it would have lots of points of entry for all sorts of different types of audiences, because some people who don't particularly like video art, it sort of looks more, it looks painterly and it looks illustrative because it's based on that. So there's people who are into science, there's a kind of science aspect to it. There are people who are into performance, there's a performance aspect. I think it's probably interesting to hear the negative comments, and they're probably things that you've struck in your own practice too. I think they're tricky to show other people's cultures, but I've spent many years working with a group called Pacific Sisters, and we're a group of urban artists and performers who've used costume and performance to sort of use it as a way of learning about our own various histories. But working with, so there's Samoan, Cook Island, Tahitian, we come from, Fijian, like a whole lot of different groups of us, and we collaborate, and we have done that for 30 years or so. So that gave me that sort of a platform to be able to feel like I could, deal with this wallpaper, this very strange depiction, and having sort of, dealt with, well, not dealt with, but, investigated tradition and change and Māori culture and Māori artworks, I felt like then I had done enough of that it felt safe enough to walk into this territory. But, like, for instance, if you look at this image, the slide that I have up here, on the left-hand side, there's a group of males, Māoris, men who are about to perform a haka, and the world knows, a lot of the world, or people who are outside the art world know Aotearoa from the haka because they've seen it performed before rugby games and rugby league games, etc. But by turning them around, like being the people on the land. That's a really different perspective. And In Pursuit of Venus, which is like POV, point of view, I was really trying to strike people's, turn their thinking around, that trying to give this platform that those people who are standing on the land are from this land. The other people are, they're the others. They're the ones arriving on these kind of European boats. And so I think that was really interesting. What was interesting in New Zealand when I first showed it is a lot of older European people, because it's not a hard political, there's a lot of politics in there for me as a person of colour, but it kind of allow people to sort of fall into it. Initially, people don't quite know what they're looking at, and they need to spend a bit of time, and they fall into it. I remember catching the lift up to the work, and there was about 8 people in the lift, and they were all in their 80s and 90s, and they'd especially come in to see this work, and they didn't know who I was, so I could sort of be a little spy. And they were talking about, oh, well, we weren't very nice, were we? And you've got to come and see it. And they were bringing their friends in to come and see the work. And so what it did is becomes a site of conversation, which is what I think happened for Israel. It's gone to the Israel Museum and these kind of contested lands and histories. I thought it's kind of interesting taking a work like this where you see these sort of similarities but differences. So it means that the audience has got an opportunity to talk about things in a kind of second, third, like step away, that you kind of third down the line, but you can still start to investigate these histories and see what they mean and how they've influenced where you are. So I think I had a Māori woman who she really had quite a visceral reaction to this work when I first shared it. And I think for her, it was because she just really had with Captain Cook, who's just this, he's a hero or a heel, depending on, where you come from. And it was a really big thing for her to sort of like look at him. And I said, but that's because we need to look at these things. We've got to look at them really quite closely and imagine what they are and what they mean. So, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but there are there's as many different reactions as there are stories. And, this is just, to me, it's just a drop in the ocean of some of the stories that I could have told. There's plenty more to be looked at. But I think it's good to kind of bring these out into the open and start talking about them and have a reckoning with that history. I think it's really great that how European people have come to it. It's been a way that they've kind of looked at it and sort of come to a different understanding. I don't explain what's happening, and people go, I don't know what's happening. I say, yeah, but that's what they would have felt like, seeing these sort of cultures, these performances, all these different things being enacted. So it kind of puts yourself in their shoes, like these different times. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing for a European audience, as much as some of the, being hassled, being sort of questioned about your intentions from other people of colour. Anyway, I suppose that's, unless there's anything else, maybe we should, I can stop share and then we can, if I can get down there.
You do have a few little questions here. In fact, one person's asked 3 questions. But I think also...
Get out of this. Yes.
I think one of the most interesting things about reflecting on what you're saying is it is very much about representation, regardless if you're Indigenous or not, and people ask questions about representation and the way in which that artists like yourself and myself remap or recreate or challenge historical representations, is that I think, and many people from our communities believe, that we need to take control of our own representation. And that is often, it can be controversial or not, but it is also an aspect of healing. And especially that something is very much part of the glue of what we do is that is often invisible, is there is intergenerational trauma. And even though that, sure, we like to focus on the more optimistic aspect of things, there are aspects of our practice and culture, and even today, which is a lot of sorry business too. And I think this kind of representation or representation is really important in how others can learn from us. And I think it also comes from a place of generosity. And there's a question here, there's quite 3 questions. I don't know, Lisa, if you can see them, if you wanted to maybe pick one of them, or did you want to have a little read of that and pick one aspect?
Okay, so this is a bit long. I think I was a bit long. How did you approach visually balancing the presence of European and Indigenous aesthetics and art forms in Pursuit of Venus? Okay, well, that's a good one. I think the wallpaper itself, I had an opportunity to replace some of the flora with actual flora from this part of the world, because the illustrator actually had been to Guadeloupe and not to down where we come from. But I thought it was good to leave some of that in as a touchstone, because the wallpaper was such a popular piece in itself. I wanted to leave that there. But there's in Pursuit of Venus, there's a couple of scenes where people are having tattoos, and I really liked that tattoo culture. A lot of it comes, of course Egyptians had their own tattoo history, but we have a very strong tradition of marking the body. Marking the body is to be clothed, even if Westerners wear clothing, but to have markings on your body, to draw blood, to go through that pain, to have this sort of shift, blood is so sacred. I wanted to incorporate those ideas into the work, and to also look at, because to me it's where artists are learning from each other, so I really like that. I wanted to put artists into the work, so you do actually see Parkinson. There's a scene where he's doing some drawings. I wanted to see that kind of free flow of knowledge from different aesthetics and different histories and different perspectives. In the soundtrack, we use like James went to the musicology department and said, if Captain Cook had an iPod, what would he have been listening to at the time? And so then we were starting to listen to the music of Bach and the kind of populist music, because we think of that as really highbrow now, but actually at the time that was the music that everyone was listening to. So we're incorporating some of those themes and tunes, which very much then changed the kind of choral and music that you'll hear in churches around the Pacific Islands, because that was the music of the time. So that's a kind of interesting thing that's been kind of incorporated into the audio aspects of the project. And why did I choose specific vignettes? For me, the vignettes, I had to, of course, look at Captain Cook's death, because I thought that was really important to imagine what that might have been like. And the chief mourner, because it had this kind of interaction and this interplay with Banks, and these kind of moments like Captain Cook and others were turning up when all these different festivals were going on, and they didn't really know what was happening. So they're kind of trampling on stuff all the time. I was sort of thinking about, oftentimes these boats were drifting out of the harbour, and what they were doing is that they thought they were going in and exchanging these trade and exchange. You'll see the tables there all the time, but they were sort of trading metal. Metal was really interesting to Pacific people, because it meant that they could do different types of artistic practice. But then what was happening are these boats were floating away with all the food that might have taken, that might have been your food source for a whole year. People were going to starve. They might end up with some metal trading objects, but they're going to be really, really very, very hungry for the next series of months until the next round of food was arriving. So, it's that feeling of those vessels on the water were really important for me. And just looking at those kind of histories and the implications of those.
I think that we're
Hi.
up. Hi, Lisa.
this is so splendid that I just want to go on and for hours. I would like nothing more. Actually, I wish we were all together.
Same.
But but I think it is time. And I'm so grateful to you both. It is just this incredible pleasure to listen to you speak together. There's so much richness to the conversation and to how you know each other also. And I think your ability to tease out questions, to talk so brilliantly about the work, and really thank you. Thank you so much. What a generous conversation this has been.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for making this opportunity, and thank you to Brook. It's really a pleasure for me. As I said to Lisa before, I've talked a lot about this work, and I just wanted it to be more interesting for me, so to have you in the room too, to kind of just to tease out some things that I might just gloss over is really wonderful.
Oh,
Well,
it's been a real pleasure.
This will be on YouTube shortly, and we'll be able to share it around the world.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing you in person, Brook, next week in Sydney, I hope, or in the next couple of weeks. We're both working for a project over there. And Lisa, I met at Nirin. We didn't even get to talk about that so much, but we had a lovely afternoon together, and that's when we met. And we hoped that I would be with you, but this is how it is in Body, Mind and Spirit. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you both.